All right, welcome back. This is the last video that will deal with the war, 1864, 1865, and the second to last video. Next one will deal with Reconstruction. So let's get going. So Grant, after his success in the West, became head of all Union armies, but will ride with Army of Virginia. I can't remember its name, but it's the Union Army. So the Army of Virginia. That's going to put him into direct conflict with Lee. And so what we're going to see here, starting in May of 1864, is a series of conflicts. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Five Forks, and then eventually Petersburg. This is about 6 weeks of fighting right here, and you can see Union armies trying to flank Confederate armies, and these fights will get pretty vicious. When they run out of ammunition, they will literally start throwing rocks at each other. But this is march, dig, fight, march, dig, fight. The first battle is at the Wilderness, May 4th and May 5th. Which is technically a Confederate victory and was a pretty horrible experience. The Wilderness is a wilderness. Even today, with all of our management of forests and whatnot, it's still a pretty not a place you would want to walk into without knowing how to get back out. And Lee won, but Grant did not retreat. Unlike his predecessors, everyone else, when Lee beat them, they retreated. George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, fighting Joe Hooker. Every time they had invaded Virginia and been beaten, they had always retreated, but Grant does not retreat. He simply keeps going. Something that Lee fears. So we can see here. It is dangerous to Lee for a siege to begin. And what is going to happen is indeed a siege will break out from June of 1864 to April of 1865, the siege of Petersburg. Lee's army is in danger because of the siege. Lee's army is not built for siege warfare. Siege warfare requires supplies and manpower, and Lee is beginning to run out of those. And so Lee recognizes the danger, but is unable to stop Grant's army, and the two armies will go into a siege here at Petersburg, and that's where we'll leave them for a while and head out west. Out west, Grant's old position in the Army of the West had been taken over by William Tecumseh Sherman, who would now continue to march through the South. His opponent was John Bell Hood, which delighted Lee because John Bell Hood was not temperamentally suited for command. John Bell Hood made rash, emotional decisions, and they cost lives. the Confederate Army. In the first 11 days of his command, John Bell Hood lost 13,000 troops attacking Sherman. Hood should have been playing defense, but Sherman knew how to goad him into attacking him. And so Sherman put it, the Confederates have done us a great service by putting John Bell Hood in charge. Paraphrase. Once Hood's armies have been weakened enough, Sherman simply bashes through them. And in September of 1864, Atlanta falls to the Union. Atlanta, one of the major cities in the South, falls to Sherman, September of 1864. Much of the city, he's managed to stay awake in Gone with the Wind long enough. You'll see the destruction of Atlanta. And so you can see here much of the destruction of railroad stock. Sherman now begins planning for his next adventure, and we're going to come back to that in a minute because we do have a presidential election. In 1864, the country does do what it does every 4 years and has its presidential election. This time, Lincoln. This is Copperhead propaganda we're looking at here. The Black Republican ticket, draft, anarchy, ruin, or George McClellan. George McClellan's back. I told you George McClellan would be back, running as the Democratic nomination. He will defeat Negro equality, restore the Union, and bring us peace. And Lincoln was worried for a while. There were things going against Lincoln. The financial cost of the war was really starting to crimp. The Union had been able to sort of rise above it, but it wouldn't be able to rise above it forever. There was the bloodshed of the war. Draft was still something the Copperheads were using, and abolition was not popular among the Copperheads either. And so Lincoln really thought he might actually be defeated, but he had nothing to worry about. Lincoln will win the election, and something that makes this election unique is the Army vote. For the first time ever, troops were allowed to vote from the field, what we would today call a mail-in ballot, where people who are stationed overseas are allowed to vote in presidential elections. That had never happened before. If you were stationed somewhere else and you weren't in your home state, you just didn't get to vote. But Lincoln will win again. I don't have the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but I will know with regards to the Army votes, about 77% of military vote will go to Lincoln. He will also win the popular vote and, of course, the Electoral College vote. So this time Lincoln will win overwhelmingly the popular vote in the Electoral College, pick up the Army vote as well. Let's get back to Sherman. Sherman came up with this plan now. This is called Sherman's March to the Sea. He was going to march from Atlanta to Savannah, both in Georgia. And he was going to take his army and split it into two great wings. He had about 90,000 men, and you can see them working their way through Georgia, and there was nothing to stop them. There's nothing left. John Bell Hood's army had retreated up towards Nashville. There was an army of the Carolinas, but they were not heading into Georgia. And so Sherman was just free to ravage the entire state. Sherman made a very important decision in the March to the Sea. He decided to cut his supply line behind him. Most armies, when they are moving through enemy territory, will leave a supply line behind them, food, ammunition, etc. Sherman decides to cut that supply line off. He will simply take what his army needs from the civilian population and burn the rest. Plantations, cotton, all of it will go up in flames. Slaves will liberate themselves and follow Sherman's army as it smashes its way through Georgia. By doing this, the effect is, one, it demonstrates to civilians in the South that the CSA cannot protect them. So it sort of loosens whatever bonds people still feel to their government. And it causes the Confederate Army desertion rate to increase. Soldiers begin deserting the army because they need to go home and take care of their families. Sherman's in Georgia. Who knows where he's going to go next? So you can see here destroying railroad track in Georgia, bending it up, and generally making it worthless. Now, Sherman had also gone off on this journey without, he didn't communicate during the whole time that he was gone. So nobody knew what had happened. You know, the War Department had no idea where he was or what was happening to him. But finally, on December 22nd, 1864, Sherman finally breaks silence, radio silence, telegraph silence, to announce that Savannah has surrendered. So he had marched that army through Georgia, destroying everything in his path, and had gotten another major Confederate city to surrender. Events are going to happen very quickly now. In February, this is all 1865, Sherman invades South Carolina, and South Carolina will eventually surrender. And in fact, Sherman will make Charleston, South Carolina, where the whole war began, he will make the mayor of Charleston surrender to a black soldier. In March, Sherman invades North Carolina, and that's where he'll be when the war ends. But again, there's really not much in the way to stop him. His opponent, Joe Johnston, this quote here, Sherman is building his own roads through the swamps by having lumberjacks go out in front of the army and cut down trees to build what were called corduroy roads. And there's very little Joe Johnston can do to stop him. When we left Grant and Lee, they were at Petersburg, and they had dug in trench warfare. We typically associate trench warfare with World War I, but we see it here in the Confederate Union War here in 1865. They dug about 50 miles of trenches along here. On April 1st, Lee's lines, which are red, finally broke. Union forces finally broke through. The siege of Petersburg finally lifted. Following that, on April 3rd, the Confederate government abandoned Richmond. These are Union troops at Petersburg. They also set fire to parts of the city as they abandoned the government, and the fire spread out of control. And so much of about a quarter of Richmond either burned down or blew up before the Union Army ever got there. We have this. This, again, this is all done before the Union Army ever arrived. This destruction of the grand old city. Lee retreated from the Petersburg-Richmond area, this desperate flight. Amelia Courthouse on the 5th, Sailor's Creek on the 6th and 7th. And at some point, Grant decided all the bloodshed is on you. This war's over. It's up to you to stop it. Lee's forces eventually made it to a place called Appomattox Station, the crossroads out in the middle of Virginia countryside. Terms of surrender were worked out, had been worked out with Lincoln. So on April 9th, Lee and Grant met. Terms of surrender. The Confederates would have to turn over rifles and artillery. They would be allowed to keep sidearms, pistols, knives, whatever. They would be allowed to keep animals. A lot of them had brought their own horse or their own donkey. And again, a lot of these people are farmers. They're going to need their animals when they go home to begin rebuilding their lives. And they would be paroled and sent home. And those are very generous terms of surrender for a civil war. Most civil wars end with the losers being shot by the winners. Lee expected he would go to jail for the rest of his life. He never did. Lee never saw the inside of a jail cell, nor did any of his troops. The only people who went to jail, the only person who went to jail was Jefferson Davis, who was held for 2 years before being released. So again, these are very generous terms of surrender. Grant also makes arrangements for food to be brought over. Lee's army was nothing to eat. So very generous terms being offered by the president at the end of this war. On April 12th, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia officially surrendered. The next day, the president sat for his final portrait. It would turn out. Unbeknownst to the president, John Wilkes Booth had begun plotting for the president's assassination. Note found in his diary. Booth was an actor, and he had begun to believe that he was somehow living out the play Julius Caesar. And so he saw Lincoln as the tyrant Caesar, and Booth saw himself as Brutus, the one who brings down the tyrant. Booth also thought that killing the president would also somehow rally the Confederacy uh, to keep fighting. To be honest, Confederates were just as horrified. Booth's diary was discovered when he was finally captured. He talks in there about the hope he had that the Confederacy would rebound with Lincoln's death. It just turned out to be a mirage. It had been a useless gesture on his part. The president is shot here at Ford's Theater while attending the play Our American Cousin, and passes away the next morning on April the 15th. In addition to assassinating the president, there have been plans to assassinate the vice president and the secretary of state. There was an attack against the secretary of state, which failed, and the guy who was supposed to kill the vice president went off and got drunk instead. So these are the other members of the Lincoln conspiracies. This is the one who attacked the secretary of state, and they will be executed that following summer after their trials. The last, Jefferson Davis is caught trying to sneak across the Mississippi River. Again, he'll spend a couple of years in jail without being formally charged before being released. He is unrepentant to the end. When he dies, he is buried in his Confederate commander's uniform. The last battle of the Civil War is fought on land here in Texas, the Palomino Ranch in South Texas. And the very last battle of the Civil War is fought off the coast of France. There was a Confederate naval ship who had not gotten the news yet and was chased into a harbor and eventually convinced that the war was over, that there was no more Confederacy. And so that turned out to be the last actual battle of the war. In our next video, we will look at Reconstruction. We will look at attempting to put things back together, which is going to be quite difficult. Reconstruction will last almost 3 times as long as the war and will not be as successful. And I will see you there.